Section 51 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4 by Henry Gray. Tunics of the Eye, Part 2. The ciliaris muscle, musculus ciliaris, Bowman's muscle, consists of unstriped fibres. It forms a greyish, semi-transparent circular band about 3 mm broad on the outer surface of the forepart of the choroid. It is thickest in front, and consists of two sets of fibres, meridional and circular. The meridional fibres, much the more numerous, arise from the posterior margin of the scleral spur. They run backward and are attached to the ciliary processes and orbiculus ciliaris. One bundle, according to Waldeyer, is inserted into the sclera. The circular fibres are internal to the meridional ones, and in a meridional section appear as a triangular zone behind the filtration angle and close to the circumference of the iris. They are well developed in hypermetropic, but are rudimentary or absent in myopic eyes. The ciliaris muscle is the chief agent in accommodation, i.e. in adjusting the eye to the vision of near objects. When it contracts it draws forward the ciliary processes, relaxes the suspensory ligament of the lens, and thus allows the lens to become more convex. The iris. The iris has received its name from its various colours in different individuals. It is a thin, circular, contractile disc, suspended in the aqueous humour between the cornea and the lens, and perforated a little to the nasal side of its centre by a circular aperture, the pupil. By its periphery it is continuous with the ciliary body, and is also connected with the posterior elastic lamina of the cornea by means of the pectinate ligament. Its surfaces are flattened, and look forward and backward, the anterior toward the cornea, the posterior toward the ciliary processes and lens. The iris divides the space between the lens and the cornea into an anterior and a posterior chamber. The anterior chamber of the eye is bounded in front by the posterior surface of the cornea, behind by the front of the iris and the central part of the lens. The posterior chamber is a narrow chink behind the peripheral part of the iris, and in front of the suspensory ligament of the lens and the ciliary processes. In the adult the two chambers communicate through the pupil, but in the fetus up to the 7th month they are separated by the membrana pupillaris. Structure. The iris is composed of the following structures. 1. In front is a layer of flattened endothelial cells placed on a delicate hyaline basement membrane. This layer is continuous with the endothelium covering the posterior elastic lamina of the cornea, and in individuals with dark-coloured irides the cells contain pigment granules. 2. The stroma iridis, of the iris, contains of fibres and cells. The former are made up of delicate bundles of fibrous tissue. A few fibres at the circumference of the iris have a circular direction, but the majority radiate toward the pupil, forming by their interlacement delicate meshes, in which the vessels and nerves are contained. Interspersed between the bundles of connective tissue are numerous branched cells with fine processes. In dark eyes, many of them contain pigment granules, but in blue eyes and the eyes of albinos they are unpigmented. 3. The muscular fibres are involuntary and consist of circular and radiating fibres. The circular fibres form the sphincter pupillae. They are arranged in a narrow band about 1 mm in width which surrounds the margin of the pupil toward the posterior surface of the iris. Those near the free margin are closely aggregated. Those near the periphery of the band are somewhat separated and form incomplete circles. The radiating fibres form the dilator pupillae. They converge from the circumference toward the centre, and blend with the circular fibres near the margin of the pupil. 4. The posterior surface of the iris is of a deep purple tint, being covered by 2 layers of pigmented columnar epithelium, continuous at the periphery of the iris with the pars ciliaris retinae. This pigmented epithelium is named the pars iridica retinae, or, from the resemblance of its colour to that of a ripe grape, the uvea. The colour of the iris is produced by the reflection of light from dark pigment cells underlying a translucent tissue, and is therefore determined by the amount of the pigment and its distribution throughout the texture of the iris. The number and situation of the pigment cells differ in different irides. The albino pigment is absent. In the various shades of the blue eyes, the pigment cells are confined to the posterior surface of the iris, whereas in grey, brown, and black eyes, pigment is found also in the cells of the stroma and in those of the endothelium on the front of the iris. The iris may be absent, either in part or altogether as a congenital condition, and in some instances the pupillary membrane may remain persistent, though it is rarely complete. Again, the iris may be the seat of a malformation, termed coloboma, which consists in a deficiency or cleft, clearly due in great number of cases to an arrest in development. In these cases the cleft is found at the lower aspect, extending directly downward from the pupil, and the gap frequently extends through the choroid to the porus opticus. In some rarer cases the gap is found in other parts of the iris, and is not then associated with any deficiency of the choroid. Vessels and nerves. The arteries of the iris are derived from the long and anterior ciliary arteries, and from the vessels of the ciliary processes. Each of the two long ciliary arteries, having reached the attached margin of the iris, divides into an upper and lower branch. These anastomose with corresponding branches from the opposite side, and thus encircle the iris. Into this vascular circle, circulus arteriosus major, the anterior ciliary arteries pour their blood, and from it vessels converge to the free margin of the iris, and there communicate and form a second circle, circulus arteriosus minor. The nerves of the choroid and iris are the long and short ciliary, the former being branches of the nasociliary nerve, the latter of the ciliary ganglion. They pierce the sclera around the entrance of the optic nerve, run forward in the perichoroidal space, and supply the blood vessels of the choroid. After reaching the iris they form a plexus around its attached margin. From this are derived non-medullated fibres which end in the sphincter and dilata pupillae. Their exact mode of termination has not been ascertained. Other fibres from the plexus end in a network on the anterior surface of the iris. The fibres derived through the motor route of the ciliary ganglion from the oculomotor nerve supply the sphincter, while those derived from the sympathetic supply the dilata. Membrana pupillaris. In the fetus, the pupil is closed by a delicate vascular membrane, the membrana pupillaris, which divides the space in which the iris is suspended into two distinct chambers. The vessels of this membrane are partly derived from those of the margin of the iris, and partly from those of the capsule of the lens. They have a looped arrangement, and converge towards each other without anastomosing. About the 6th month the membrane begins to disappear by absorption from the centre towards the circumference, and at birth only a few fragments are present. In exceptional cases it persists. The retina, tunica interna. The retina is a delicate nervous membrane upon which the images of external objects are received. Its outer surface is in contact with the choroid, its inner with the hyaloid membrane of the vitreous body. Behind it is continuous with the optic nerve. It gradually diminishes in thickness from behind forward, and extends nearly as far as the ciliary body, where it appears to end in a jagged margin, the ora serrata. Here the nervous tissues of the retina end, but a thin prolongation of the membrane extends forward over the back of the ciliary processes and iris, forming the pars ciliaris retinae and pars iridica retinae already referred to. This forward prolongation consists of the pigmentary layer of the retina together with a stratum of columnar epithelium. The retina is soft, semi-transparent, and of a purple tint in the fresh state, owing to the presence of a colouring material named rhodopsin, or visual purple, but it soon becomes clouded, opaque, and bleached when exposed to sunlight. Exactly in the centre of the posterior part of the retina, corresponding to the axis of the eye, and at a point in which the sense of vision is most perfect, is an oval yellowish area, the macula lutea. In the macula is a central depression, the fovea centralis. At the fovea centralis the retina is exceedingly thin, and the dark colour of the choroid is distinctly seen through it. About 3 mm to the nasal side of the macula lutea is the entrance of the optic nerve. optic disc, the circumference of which is